Sports are one of the most popular forms of entertainment and have been a part of human society for as long as people have lived together in groups. However, unlike the safety-conscious billion-dollar industries that many modern sports have become, the games played by our ancestors were far darker and dangerous. Firmly rooted in training and preparation for war, these sports pitted men against one another in highly charged and often incredibly violent matches, where participants faced the very real risk of suffering a grievous injury or worse. Here are my choices for 5 of the most brutal sports in history. Number 5. The Mayan War Game. Played as far back as 3,500 years ago, this ancient American sport was much more than just a game, with every match a matter of life and death, as the players competed not only for victory and glory, but for their very lives, in a fast-paced and brutal ritualistic contest, where severe injuries were not only common, but accepted as part of the sport. As the 9-pound solid rubber ball hurtled around the stone court at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, bruising exposed flesh, breaking bones, and even killing contestants, with the final whistle ending not just the game, but the lives of one unlucky team who would be beheaded in a dark sacrifice to appease angry gods. First played by Mesoamerican groups in around 2500 BC, the sport is one of the oldest athletic games in human history. The tribes of ancient Central and South America, including the Maya and Aztecs, utilizing the commonly found rubber tree to create a bouncing ball that would spawn a competitive game that was part sport, part religious ritual. The ruins of the courts upon which the game was played have been found at hundreds of locations stretching from Nicaragua in the south to as far north as the US state of Arizona, and although played by numerous tribes and peoples living in these areas, perhaps the most well-preserved examples of the sport are in what's left of the Maya and Aztec cities. The courts were one of the city's main focal points, often located near its main temple, and although usually the size of a basketball court, some were as big as a football field. The stadium's long central alleyway was flanked by 2 slanted side walls on which the ball could be bounced and ricocheted, and high platforms on either side allowed huge numbers of spectators to view the action taking place below. Yet most disturbingly of all, the structures included massive skull racks, which it's thought would be filled with the heads of previous players who had lost and subsequently been sacrificed. The empty eye sockets of the dozens of skulls gazing down upon the players below as a grim reminder of just how much was at stake in the match. The exact rules and objectives of the game are not entirely known, but utilizing references found at various sites, along with accounts from Spanish explorers, it's thought that the game was similar to modern-day racquetball, where the primary aim is to keep the ball in play. 2 teams of between 2 and 6 players each would attempt to force their opponents to lose control of the ball and let it touch the ground, striking the 9-pound sphere of rubber with just their hips, legs, forearms, knees, and elbows, while other variations of the game allowed for the use of rackets and bats. However, one common theme amongst these variations seems to be the rule that no hands could be used to touch the ball. Points could be gained by hitting the wall at the end of the court with the ball. However, points would be deducted if the ball touched the floor more than twice or went out of the designated boundaries, while passing the ball through the stone ring attached to both side walls and raised several meters from the ground would earn a decisive victory and end the game immediately, thanks to the incredible difficulty of achieving such a feat. Despite usually being clad in basic protective gear such as hip guards, helmets, and knee pads, the sheer violence of the game, combined with the 9-pound solid rubber ball hurtling around at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, meant that terrible injuries were a frequent occurrence, with each player almost certain to be bloodied and bruised by the end of the match, as players threw themselves against the walls and ground as they desperately fought to keep the ball in play. Spanish explorers who observed matches taking place noted that the players' bodies were almost completely covered in bruises, with some being so bad that they needed to be lanced open, while the heavy and fast-moving ball frequently outright killed players when it hit them in the head or ruptured their internal organs after an especially hard blow to the body. When the game finally came to an end, only one of the teams would be going home. However, historians are still in disagreement about which side would live to play another day. Some believe that the losing team would be sacrificed to the gods upon the court by suffering disembowelment and decapitation, while others believe that since it was a great honor to be sacrificed, such a grisly fate was reserved only for winners, and there is even speculation that the heads and skulls of players sacrificed in previous matches would sometimes be used as balls. In fact, such scenes of human sacrifice feature heavily in artwork found on ball court panels, leading some historians to theorize that the ball game was also used for sacrificing captives taken during war, the prisoners forced to play a rigged game that would result in their heads being offered up as a tribute to the gods. It's clear that the game was seen as far more than just a simple sport by the people who practiced it, and it's thought that the contest may have been used as a method for resolving disputes and conflict before they escalated into outright war, the outcome of a ball game settling disagreements without the need for a destructive and bloody battle. The ball court evolved into an important part of Mayan and Aztec culture, becoming the scene of religious rituals and mythical reenactments, and it's possible that the spectators believed that the match itself represented a literal battle between light and darkness, with the sacrifice of one team a necessary step to satisfy the gods and ward off the end of the world. Yet a game of such grand importance did not escape the more base of human traits, and Spanish observers commented with disgust on how the locals participated in large-scale betting, even going so far as to bet their homes, farms, and children on the outcome of a single game, with some even staking their own lives on a match, forced to become slaves or even worse, should they lose. Number 4. Chariot racing. A favourite of both the Greeks and Romans, chariot racing was without doubt the most popular spectator sport in the ancient world. The bored citizens who populated sprawling cities like Rome and Constantinople, drawn to the opportunity for escapism offered by the bloody spectacle the sport had become, with vast crowds of over 250,000 filling the legendary Circus Maximus in Rome to revel in the violence and death that a match was almost guaranteed to offer, as racers from across the empire were drawn to its cities and the promise of wealth, risking gruesome deaths on the stadium sands for a chance of untold fame and riches. The lucky few who against the odds made vast fortunes, eclipsed by the forgotten majority, who would meet a grisly end, crushed under the wheels and hooves of their opponent's chariot and horses, or smashed against the cold stone columns of the racetrack, to the sounds of cheers and applause from the bloodthirsty fans, their broken and lifeless bodies to be collected and disposed of at the end of a match, as though they were merely litter, cleansing the sands before the next race, where the violent cycle would begin again, in a never-ending quest to satisfy the demands of spectators for excitement and danger. For as long as mankind has been riding horses, he has also been racing them, and records dating as far back as ancient Egypt show just how much of an integral part of ancient culture horse racing was. However, chariot racing first seems to have become a crowd favourite with the ancient Greeks, with the sport being one of the main events at the Olympics, as prominent Greeks sought to demonstrate their prosperity to the masses by funding the competitors in an effort to win public exposure and fame. Yet it was the Romans who took this ancient sport and turned it into a violent spectacle for the masses, with vast fortunes wagered on the outcome of a race, as city streets emptied into the circuses and amphitheatres that rapidly sprung up across the empire, her people desperate to escape the humdrum existence of everyday life with a brief moment of bloody escapism, with the jewel in the empire's sporting crown being the Circus Maximus, a vast racetrack that was said to have been able to seat as many as 250,000 spectators, hungry for mayhem, destruction, and excitement. The chariot races were usually organised into 4 teams, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, with each team attracting its own set of almost fanatical supporters from the spectators. Each team was allowed to enter up to 3 chariots in a single race, with members of the same team often working together to try and eliminate their mutual opponents, forcing them to crash or lose control of their chariot. Yet individual racers were not bound to a single team, and were free to transfer or even be traded amongst the various factions, much like sports teams trade and transfer players today. 2-wheeled chariots were drawn by 2, 4, or even 6 horses, with the goal of completing 7 laps of the circus before any of the other entrants, as the charioteers battled against one another, each doing their best to seize the advantage by taking the shorter route along the inside of the track. Charioteers were more often than not slaves desperate for a way to earn money to buy their own freedom, or men drawn from the lower classes by the potential for immense wealth and fame. However, the dangers they would face on the stadium sands were staggering. A series of staggered mechanical gates allowed a fair start for all participants. However, once the race began, all ideals of fair play were completely discarded, as each man used any and all means necessary to beat his opponents, no matter how risky or outright unsportsmanlike. The chariots darted in front of one another in an attempt to cause their opponents to swerve and crash, using every dirty trick in the book to break their rivals' concentration and cause them to suffer an accident. And with the meagre rules that existed rarely enforced, whips, stones, and a variety of weapons could be used on any charioteer or horse within striking distance in an effort to drive them out of the race, while even spectators got involved in the action, hurtling lead-cursed charms embedded with nails into the paths of chariots that threatened to overtake the team they supported. In the heat of the race, aggression and ruthlessness were every bit as important as skill. Yet perhaps the most dangerous part of the race was also the part that excited the crowd the most. The sharp turns at the two ends of the track are where most of the crashes, referred to by the Romans as shipwrecks, took place, as chariots travelling at high speed careened around the tight corners and frequently lost control and overturned, hurtling the driver onto the sands and into the path of the horses and chariots behind him, where should he survive the initial crash, he would face a grisly death trampled under an assortment of stampeding hooves and crushing wheels. The chariots themselves were built to be as light as possible, so that they could travel even faster. However, this made them far more vulnerable than ordinary war chariots, and safety wasn't helped by the fact that the drivers wrapped the horse reins around their waist, meaning that in the event of a crash, the driver would be unable to simply let go and would instead be dragged to his death by the horses as they continued to charge around the circus. In fact, the sport was so dangerous that a recent study of charioteer graves revealed that the average age of death for the men was just 22, and even attempting to film just a recreation of the sport is fraught with danger, as shown by the 1926 Hollywood movie Ben-Hur, where the chariot racing scenes cost the lives of 5 horses and 1 stuntman. Yet with great risk comes great rewards. A long enough winning streak could lead to immense fame and wealth, and some estimates suggest that the highest paid athlete of all time was an ancient Roman charioteer who is said to have amassed a fortune of around $15 billion during his career, which numbered several thousand races, which if true would make him the richest sports star in history. Number 3. Mob football. Modern-day soccer has been plagued by outbreaks of disorder and violence at matches, where rival hooligan fans who follow their chosen clubs with a tribal passion wage small-scale wars against one another. However, the professional billion-dollar industry that is the modern sport of football can trace its roots back to a number of various types of ball game played by peasants in medieval Europe, where it wasn't the brutality of the fans that authorities had to be concerned about, but that of the players, as entire towns took to the streets to engage in a pastime that was little more than a semi-organized mass riot, with players venting pent-up anger and frustration upon one another, resulting in frequent terrible injuries and even deaths. At some time around the 14th century, localized versions of a game involving an inflated pig's bladder began springing up in towns and cities across Europe, this archaic version of soccer growing wildly popular as it required no specialized or expensive equipment and was therefore accessible to all, regardless of wealth and social class. Religious holidays such as Shrove Tuesday were one of the few times the hard-worked peasants had for leisure and relaxation, and so on these rare opportunities for socializing and fun, entire towns and villages began competing against one another in a ball-based game that had virtually no rules. With no limit on the number of players involved, 2 swarming mobs from neighbouring towns would clash on the streets and in the fields, each side struggling for control of the inflated pig's bladder that served as a ball, with just a single objective: get the ball to the designated goal by any means possible, with only outright murder disallowed. Often the 2 teams' goals could be several miles apart, and with so many hundreds or even thousands of people clashing in what was essentially an organised riot, matches could take several hours to wind down, with players dropping out of the game due to sheer exhaustion from the prolonged struggle. With so many people battling against one another in tightly confined streets and town squares, it's no surprise that injuries and even deaths were not only common, but accepted as part and parcel of the sport. Large gatherings of people will always attract unsavory characters with violence on their mind, and combined with the already heightened tensions brought about by strong and often hostile rivalries between the 2 teams, tempers would often flare, with the game being used as an excuse to take out personal frustrations on others and indulge in bloodshed that, on any normal day, would have been unacceptable in the community. In the tight press of brawling men, bruised skin, bloodied noses, and broken limbs would likely be suffered by anyone brave or foolish enough to get too close to the action, and reports of stabbings and other deadly attacks are common, yet the deaths were not always deliberate. In one mob football match in medieval France, 40 men are reported to have drowned in a pond when the ball found its way into the water, the players forced underwater by the huge crowds, and it's likely that people suffocating, or simply having the life crushed out of them under the weight of the mob, was an all too common occurrence. Unsurprisingly, authorities attempted to crack down on what they saw as a public nuisance, and even a danger to the status quo, as peasants organised into large, coherent groups could pose a real threat to the establishment, and so kings repeatedly tried to ban the sport with little success, the violent pastime of peasants evolving into the money-making industry that is modern-day soccer. Number 2. Jousting. What started out as little more than training for war during times of peace would evolve into a high-stakes display of courage, skill, speed and strength that would capture the imagination of peasants, nobles and even kings from across medieval Europe. The spectacle of heavily armoured mounted knights charging towards each other, thrilling crowds hungry to witness the clash of arms and potential spilling of blood as the two armoured juggernauts collided with a crushing force 3¼ times their body weight, in a medieval high-risk extreme sport that would frequently result in horrific injuries and even deaths, as pointed lances crashed into armour, the participants willing to risk disfigurement, and worse, for the chance to showcase their courage and skill in front of the watching world. The medieval mounted knight was perhaps the most devastating battlefield weapon that the world had yet seen, with just a single charge from these armoured titans enough to sweep away the opposition and turn the tide of a war, the sight and sound of the rapidly approaching wall of iron enough to cause even the bravest foe to turn and flee for his life. However, like all professional full-time warriors, the knights needed constant training during times of peace to maintain their fearsome combat and equestrian skills. What became known as jousting initially started as a way for knights to hone their craft in peacetime by pitting them against fellow warriors in what was essentially a mock battle and combat simulation that would keep them at a high state of readiness should their liege need to call them to arms. In their early form, the jousts simply involved a handful of knights engaging in a mass melee. However, as they started to become more popular, with the spectators who watched them from the safety of the sidelines, they began evolving into something far more elaborate and spectacular. With fans of the jousts demanding ever more entertainment, and with the knights more than happy to show off their prowess to ever greater numbers of people, these mock battles grew into formal tournaments that would be planned months in advance, becoming elaborate displays of opulence that were publicised by heralds through poems and songs, while the best warriors from across Europe would be attracted to the shows, keen to demonstrate their bravery and skill in front of the rich and powerful, watching on with admiration from the seats with the best views. The early forms of the jousting tournaments simply involved mass fights, where the aim was to incapacitate your opponent and thus win a ransom, yet the more structured later versions of the joust centered around a mock battle between two mounted knights who would charge at each other and use their long lances to try and unhorse their opponent, or failing that to score points by breaking their lance against their rival's shield and armour. After the lances had been used up, the fight could continue using shorter range weapons like axes and swords. However, the crowd seems to have been most enthralled with the mounted version of the joust. Strict rules governed the simulated combat, which was not supposed to be lethal, and violations of these regulations would result in a knight losing points. Deliberately targeting the opponent's horse was considered an outrageous violation of the chivalric code of conduct, and could have you ejected from a tournament, while killing the opposing knight outright would usually be considered a severe enough act to justify the docking of points. A knight could increase his score by breaking lances against and landing blows on the enemy, while unhorsing his opponent would score bonus points, yet when the joust progressed to the close combat stage, the weaker of the two knights was expected to yield to the dominant fighter before things got too serious. However, major injuries and deaths were unavoidable, and indeed expected, given the nature of the sport. Two mounted warriors clad in full plate armour, weighing over 100 pounds, and charging towards each other at speeds up to 30 miles per hour, creates a lot of momentum. This huge force concentrated at the point of a long, thin lance aimed at the other knight's shoulder, so it's no surprise that broken bones, dislocated shoulders, and even shattered necks and backs were commonplace. And when you consider the primitive medical treatments available at the time, even a minor injury could cause death. Every knight knew full well the risks he was taking when entering a tournament. However, the potential rewards for jousting success were simply too irresistible to ignore. Jousting offered knights not only an opportunity for prestige and fame, won in front of crowds which could often exceed 10,000, but also the chance to amass huge wealth through prizes of money, land, and titles. And winning big tournaments could lead to lucrative mercenary contracts from warlords on the lookout for skilled military professionals. Yet even those who already had everything a man could desire were still attracted to jousting by the opportunity to show just how courageous they were, with several kings taking part in the risky matches. However, death knows no rank, and royal blood would be spilt just like that of any other man. King Henry II of France died in 1559 when a large splinter from the shattered lance of his opponent found its way through his armoured helmet, fatally piercing the king's eye, and several other European kings suffered injuries that would plague them for their remaining lives. Number 1. Gladiator Combat. It's no surprise that a competition where the primary objective is to disable or kill your opponent in hand-to-hand combat can be considered the bloodiest sport in history. These violent matches between gladiators who were usually slaves and war captives taken during Rome's many destructive conquests, thrilling crowds across the empire over hundreds of years, during which perhaps hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of men would take their last breath on the arena sands under the gaze of an enthusiastic audience and cruel, uncaring patricians. These ranks of the damned who were considered at best commodities to be used for profit, and at worst little more than animals, fighting not just for their lives, but to entertain and gain the approval of the spectators. For a gladiator who lacked the crowd's support might one day find himself also lacking their mercy when the inevitable time that he needed it came. The fate of defeated but still living gladiators, frequently decided by the whims of the watching mob, whose favour was fleeting and fickle. The exact origin of gladiatorial combat is unclear and open to debate. However, one of the earliest recorded fights is said to have taken place at the funeral of a prominent Roman aristocrat, where slaves were forced to fight to the death in a violent spectacle that was arranged by the dead man's relatives to honour his memory, while perhaps providing him with dead warriors to act as his attendants in the afterlife. However, the unusual practice was quickly copied by other families, keen to give their deceased loved ones a lavish send-off. The Roman elite sought to outdo one another by making provisions in their wills for ever more lavish gladiatorial contests, and it wasn't long before the more cynical-minded noticed just how popular these armed duels were with the common man, exploiting their ability to thrill and entertain the mob as a way to purchase popularity and influence by sponsoring elaborate games that sometimes involved as many as 300 pairs of gladiators, providing a free spectacle for the local community, while at the same time showing off just how rich, powerful, and generous the sponsor was. The sport became a huge money-making business, where the lives of countless slaves and war captives were ended in public view in exchange for profit and prestige, and hundreds of amphitheatres sprung up across the empire, each one using violence and death as a means to celebrate everything from important military victories to birthdays and public holidays, while some games were even held during turbulent times as a way of distracting the mob from the current problems that might have otherwise caused riots. The unfortunate men who found themselves reduced to little more than fresh meat for the grinder that was this macabre sport were usually drawn from the ranks of slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. However, despite gladiators being doomed to a short life of hardship and brutality, many free men voluntarily joined one of Rome's many gladiator schools, perhaps seeking adventure, fame, and the crowd's approval, or simply looking for an opportunity to pay off a crippling debt. Fed a high-energy diet, provided with a roof over their head, and with a fighting chance at amassing great riches, in the harsh Roman world, perhaps the role of gladiator was not the worst fate that could befall a man. The fight between gladiators seems to have been governed by an intricate and elaborate set of rules, although the exact details are now sadly lost to time. However, what is known is that organisers and spectators expected gladiators to abide by the regulations, and there was even a referee present in the arena, tasked with enforcing them, a man who was usually an ex-gladiator and whose decisions would have been respected by the younger fighters. Combatants would attempt to land blows on the major arteries under the arm and behind the knee in an effort to end the fight as quickly as possible, and most bouts are thought to have lasted around 10 minutes, with few going on for longer than 20 minutes, due to the exertion a fight to the death wrought upon the body. However, simply ending a match quickly and efficiently was not the only thing on the gladiator's mind. Gladiatorial combat was essentially war morphed into a sport to thrill the masses in a display of martial skill and nerve, yet the watching crowd were primarily there to be entertained and nothing more. Contrary to popular belief, gladiators were rarely outright killed by their opponents, and defeat usually came in the form of being bested in combat, the vanquished fighter forced to yield to the superior skill and athleticism of his foe, doing so by raising his hand or finger, a sign of submission and a request for mercy. Yet the defeated man's fate was often dependent upon the goodwill of the crowd, goodwill which could be won or lost, depending on how well he was judged to have fought. Always hungry to please the mob and win public favour, the sponsor of the games would judge by the crowd's reaction to this request for mercy whether to spare the defeated gladiator or to order the victor to finish him off. As the champion loomed over his prone opponent, poised to deliver the fatal blow, he looked to the editor for a signal on how to proceed. His hand stayed until the final verdict was delivered. If the crowd judged the defeated man's performance to be valiant, they would urge the editor to save his life. However, should the man have acted cowardly or displeased the mob in some way, there would be demands for his blood. A turn of the editor's thumb would seal the fallen gladiator's fate, with the most common way of finishing off the defeated gladiator being to plunge a sword downwards through his neck and into his heart, killing the man instantly and ending the match, making way for the next bout, of which there could be many each day. Across perhaps dozens of matches, a wide range of gladiators fighting with vastly differing styles would be pitted against each other, with combinations that greatly contrasted one another being especially popular. The fast-moving but highly vulnerable net fighter, armed with just a trident and net, would frequently be paired with the heavily armoured but highly encumbered secutor, the differences between the two heightening the interest and suspense created by the fight, while a whole host of other matchups including dual-wielding swordsmen, mounted fighters, charioteers and lasso men kept the games varied and prevented the matchups becoming stale. With 400 arenas across the empire slaughtering an estimated 8,000 people every year, the sport grew into a vast exercise in mass murder, with the gladiators who fed the crowd's insatiable hunger for blood unlikely to live past their 20s, with most estimated to survive no more than 5 to 10 bouts, with many perishing in their first match due to a lack of skill and experience in armed combat. Only the strongest, toughest, luckiest and most adored by the crowd would survive to have any long-term career. However, for those few who did, the potential rewards to be won were immense. Vast fortunes, the affections of high-born women, lands and even freedom could be obtained through victory and winning the crowd's support and admiration, and despite the risky nature of the business, contrary to popular opinion, not every match ended with one of the fighters' death. A gladiator represented a considerable investment. Purchasing a slave and then training, feeding and caring for him over many years made the more skilled fighters highly valuable, and their owners would be reluctant to simply throw their lives away. The majority of contests actually ended when one fighter was wounded or exhausted and thus yielded to his opponent, and if a game's sponsor required killing, the gladiator trainer would charge a fee 100 times larger. Hence, sponsors wishing to supply the crowd with death would need to have very deep purses. Nevertheless, death would eventually come for all but the most talented gladiators, yet the epitaphs of those who fell on the sands reveal that many were proud of their profession, bearing no resentment for the cards life had dealt them, perhaps accepting of their place in the world. However, for those who were reluctant to fight willingly, leather whips and red-hot iron bars could be used to motivate the more rebellious-minded gladiators into cooperation. Yet cases of mass defiance did occur, with one notable example being that of a group of German prisoners who strangled each other in their cells rather than allow their deaths to provide entertainment for their hated enemies. So those are my choices for 5 of the most brutal sports in history. As always, thanks for spending your time watching my videos, and I hope to see you again soon.